There are moments in a person's life that reveal, with perfect and terrible clarity, exactly who the people around them truly are. Not the faces they wear to church, or the voices they use at dinner parties, or the carefully rehearsed warmth they perform for company, but the real thing, the bone-deep truth of who someone becomes when they believe they hold all the power and the person across from them holds none. Marcus Webb had one of those moments on a Thursday in November at a dining room table that wasn't his, surrounded by people who had decided, without asking, without knowing, without caring to find out, exactly what he was worth. They seated him in the kitchen, not metaphorically, not as some misunderstanding that could be laughed off later over a second glass of wine. They pulled a chair up to the kitchen counter, set a place among the cooling pans and the stacked cutting boards, and told him that the dining room was simply too full this year. They smiled when they said it. That was the part Marcus would remember longest, not the humiliation itself, but the ease of it, the smile that accompanied it. The way his mother-in-law, Diane Hargrove, patted his arm as she said it, as though she were doing him a kindness. What Diane Hargrove did not know, what none of them knew, was that the man eating alone in their kitchen was the sole heir to the Webb Capital Group, a private equity and real estate holding company valued at just over $4 billion. What they did not know was that the unassuming 34-year-old who had married their daughter Claire 18 months ago, the man who drove a 6-year-old sedan and wore the same 3 dress shirts in rotation, was quietly in the process of finalizing the largest commercial real estate acquisition in their city's history. What they did not know was that Marcus Webb had spent the better part of his adult life choosing to be seen for nothing, because he had learned slowly and at great personal cost that being underestimated was the clearest lens through which to see the truth of other people. He was about to see a great deal of truth before that Thanksgiving ended. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you have been with this channel for a while, you already know that the stories we tell here are about something that goes far deeper than money or status. They are about the unshakable human need to be seen and treated with dignity, regardless of what you own, or what you wear, or whose name you carry. We would love it if you would hit the like button before we go any further, and if stories like this one speak to something in you, consider subscribing so you never miss what comes next. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Because this community stretches much further than you might imagine, and we love knowing who is here. Now, let us go back to where this really began. Marcus Webb did not grow up wealthy. That is the first thing that is essential to understand, because it shapes everything that follows. His father, Robert Webb, had built Webb Capital from a single distressed commercial property purchased with borrowed money in 1987 in a city that everyone else had already given up on. Robert was the son of a high school janitor and a seamstress, and he carried that origin not as a source of shame, but as a compass. It told him which direction was north, morally speaking, every single time he was tempted to forget where he had come from. Marcus grew up watching his father treat the parking attendant outside their office building with the same focused attention he gave to the governor of the state. He watched Robert Webb look people in the eye. He watched him remember names. He watched him sit with the discomfort of being underestimated early in his career and use it as fuel rather than allowing it to corrode him into bitterness. Robert passed away from a sudden cardiac event when Marcus was 28 years old and left everything, all of it, every holding, every partnership agreement, every carefully cultivated relationship across 4 decades of business to his only son. Marcus did not tell people. That was the decision he made, quietly, at his father's gravesite on a cold February morning, with the city spread out below the hill behind him. He looked at the headstone, and he thought about every person who had ever tried to get close to his father because of what Robert had, rather than who Robert was, and he made himself a promise. He would live an ordinary-looking life. He would drive an ordinary car. He would continue to work not as the CEO. That was handled by a capable executive named Dennis Park, but as a consulting architect, his original profession, the work he had done before his father died and which he genuinely loved. He would let people form their opinions of him based on what they could see. He met Claire Hargrove at a project review meeting 3 years after his father's death. She was a structural engineer. She was precise and funny, and she had a habit of tapping her pen against her palm when she was thinking hard about something, and he fell in love with her so quickly it surprised him. He told her about the inheritance on their 4th date, in a quiet restaurant where no one knew him. He sat across from her and watched her face and told her everything. She was quiet for a long time afterward. Then she said, "So nothing I assumed about you is actually true." And he said, "Everything important is." She thought about that. Then she tapped her pen against the tablecloth and said, "Okay." They were engaged 11 months later. Claire was adamant that her family not be told about the Webb Capital inheritance until they were married and settled. Her reasoning was practical and also quietly heartbreaking. She knew her family. She knew her mother. She wanted to be sure that her wedding was about her marriage and not about suddenly becoming interesting to people who had spent years treating her relationship as a curiosity at best and an embarrassment at worst. Marcus respected that. He understood it deeply. They agreed. Ordinary life, ordinary presentation, and the information would be shared when Claire felt the time was right. The time had not yet felt right by their first Thanksgiving as a married couple. The Hargrove family operated on a hierarchy so internally consistent that it would have been impressive had it not been so cruel. At the top of that hierarchy sat Diane and Gerald Hargrove, Claire's parents, who had built a moderately successful chain of kitchen supply stores across 3 states and regarded their financial comfort as evidence of their inherent superiority over most of the people they encountered. Beneath them, in descending order of favor, sat Claire's older brother Preston, who worked in Diane and Gerald's business, and who had the particular confidence of a man who has never once been seriously challenged, and Preston's wife, Natasha, Net, who had come from old money that had mostly evaporated but who wielded the name and the accent with remarkable persistence. Then there was Claire. And, beside Claire, some distance below, in the Hargrove family's internal accounting, there was Marcus. Marcus had been assessed in the 18 months since he and Claire began dating seriously, with the thoroughness of someone conducting a disappointing inspection. Gerald had shaken Marcus's hand the first time they met, and then immediately asked what kind of car he drove and whether he owned or rented. When Marcus answered honestly, a 6-year-old Accord renting currently, looking at properties, Gerald had made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a dismissal, but existed in the uncomfortable space between them. Diane had been warmer in presentation and colder in substance, asking Marcus questions about his work that were phrased as interest but were structured as tests. Each answer she received filed away as further evidence of inadequacy. When they learned Marcus was a consulting architect, the response had been a collectively raised eyebrow. Consulting, not a partner at a firm, not running his own studio. Consulting. The words sat in the air of the Hargrove living room like a politely contained sigh. Preston had been more direct in the way that men who have never learned the difference between honesty and cruelty tend to be more direct. He'd asked Marcus at a family birthday dinner 6 months after the wedding what exactly his ceiling was in his field. Marcus had looked at him steadily and said he supposed it depended on what you considered the ceiling to be. Preston had smiled the smile of a man who considers the question already answered and moved on to another subject. Natasha contributed through observation, mostly. The long look at Marcus's watch, the brief pause before accepting a suggestion he made, the way she laughed, a half-second slower than everyone else, when Marcus said something genuinely funny, as though she wanted to make sure it wasn't beneath her first. Claire navigated all of this the way she navigated complex structural problems, with precision, with patience, and with a tension in her jaw that Marcus recognized and hated. She defended him when she could. She deflected when she couldn't. She apologized to him in private with a sincerity that broke his heart a little each time, because he did not want her to be in the position of apologizing for her own family. And yet, there they both were. The Thanksgiving gathering was held at the Hargrove family home, a large colonial in a suburb north of the city that Diane kept in a state of immaculate presentation, as though a magazine photographer might arrive at any moment. Marcus and Claire drove out on Wednesday evening and stayed overnight. By Thursday morning, the house was already filling. Preston and Natasha arrived at 10 with their 2 children and an enormous gift basket from a specialty food shop that Natasha mentioned by name 3 times within the first 40 minutes. Gerald's brother Howard and his wife came at 11. A family friend named Colette, whom Marcus had never met, arrived at noon with a bottle of wine that Gerald held up and admired at considerable length. The table in the dining room was set for 11. Marcus counted the chairs himself when he walked past the dining room at 11:30. 11 chairs. 11 people in the house, including himself. He registered this, filed it quietly, and went back to the kitchen where he had been helping Claire prep the sweet potato dish she'd been making since college. The moment arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, approximately 40 minutes before dinner was to be served. Diane moved through the kitchen with the focused energy of someone choreographing a performance, and she stopped beside Marcus with one of her warmest, most elaborately constructed smiles and said, "Marcus, sweetheart, I'm so sorry about this. We're a little tight on space this year, with Howard and Pat and Colette all joining. We're going to have you eat in here, at the counter. It's actually cozier, I think, and you'll be right next to the food." She patted his arm. "The men are going to want seconds, and you can just grab things right from here." She had already moved the chair. There was already a place setting at the kitchen counter, beside the stove. The room was entirely quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Marcus looked at the place setting. He looked at the 11 chairs he had already counted through the dining room doorway. He looked at Claire, who had gone very still beside the kitchen island, a serving spoon in her hand, and a look on her face that Marcus recognized. It was the look of someone choosing between 2 terrible options in real time. Claire opened her mouth. Her mother was already moving away. "Mom," Claire said. Her voice was steady but fragile at its edges, the way structural steel looks steady until you know where the stress has been applied. "There's room. There are exactly 11 chairs and 11 people. Preston's children are using the 2 end chairs," Diane said, not turning around. "We don't have a children's table this year. They could share a bench, or we could bring in a chair from the office. There's one right. Claire." The single word landed with the finality of a gavel. "I have been managing this household's Thanksgiving for 31 years. Let me manage it." That was the end of that conversation. Preston appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later, ostensibly to refill his drink. He looked at the place, setting at the counter. He looked at Marcus. He said, "Sorry, man," with the tone of someone who was not sorry in any meaningful sense. And then he left. Natasha did not appear at all. Marcus understood that this was a choice. Marcus sat in the kitchen for Thanksgiving dinner. He ate his food at the counter while 11 people sat in the dining room 15 feet away. He could hear the conversation clearly, the toasts, the laughter, Diane describing the wine, Gerald holding court about the state of the retail sector, Preston's confident pronouncements about the economy. He could hear Claire's voice occasionally, quieter than the others, and he could hear the particular quality of her silence when she chose not to speak. He ate slowly. He thought clearly. He was not shaking with anger. He had moved through anger sometime around 2:15 and had arrived somewhere quieter and more deliberate on the other side of it. He thought about his father sitting in their small kitchen on Maple Street when Marcus was 7 years old, eating breakfast before a day of work that most people would have found punishing, and doing it with a quality of presence that Marcus had not had the vocabulary for as a child, but understood completely now. Dignity, his father used to say, is not something other people give you. It is something you carry. The moment you let someone else decide whether you have it or not, you have already given it away. Marcus kept his dignity in that kitchen. Meant Marcus. He cleared his own plate. He refilled his own water glass. And when Gerald wandered in at the end of the meal looking for the pie server and found Marcus still seated at the counter, Gerald gave him the look, brief, almost reflexive, of a man checking that an object is still in the place he left it. "Everything good in here?" Gerald asked. "Fine," Marcus said. "Thank you for having me." Gerald nodded and took the pie server and left. On the drive home that night, Claire did not speak for the first 20 minutes. Then she said, "I'm going to tell them." Her voice was made of something hard and quiet. "I've been protecting them from information they don't deserve to be protected from. And I'm done." Marcus drove for a moment. "Let's think about how," he said. "I don't want to think about how," Claire said. "I want them to know." "I know," he said. "Me too." What neither of them had yet told the other, what Marcus had been carrying since that Wednesday morning when his attorney had called, was that the timing of the revelation was no longer entirely within their control. Because something had happened, something significant and public and entirely impossible to contain. The Webb Capital Group's acquisition of the Hargrove District, which was the name, with all its exquisite irony, fully unregistered by everyone involved, of the historic commercial corridor that ran through the center of the city, had been announced publicly that Monday. The announcement had run in the regional business press, the city's main newspaper, and had been picked up by 2 national publications. The announcement named Marcus Webb as the beneficial owner of Webb Capital Group and as the primary architect of the acquisition's development plan. Marcus had not told Claire yet about the announcement because the timing had been moved up by his communications team without adequate notice, and he had spent Monday through Wednesday in a cascade of calls and meetings trying to manage the rollout. He had planned to tell her Wednesday evening. She had been exhausted when they arrived at her parents' house, and they had gone to bed early. Thursday had become what Thursday had become. He told her in the car, on the highway, at 9:43 in the evening. Claire was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "The announcement ran Monday." He said yes. She said, "And my family spent Thursday putting you in the kitchen." He said yes. She turned to look out the passenger window. When she turned back, something had shifted in her face, not toward cruelty, because Claire was not built for cruelty, but toward a quality of clarity that Marcus had seen in her before, usually when she was looking at a structural diagram that had told her something important. The kind of clarity that has no sentimentality in it. "They're going to find out," she said, not a question. "Yes," Marcus said, "probably very soon." "Good," said Claire. "It took 4 days. Gerald Hargrove was the one who found it." He had a habit of scanning the regional business news on Monday mornings with his coffee. He tracked the retail sector obsessively, looking for patterns that might affect his stores-to-supplier relationships. He was on his second cup when he saw the headline about the Hargrove District acquisition. He read the article. He read the name. He read the article again. He called Diane into the kitchen. She read it standing over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Then Diane said, "That's Claire's Marcus." And Gerald said, "That's Claire's Marcus." And then they both did something that people do when information arrives that is too large to be immediately processed. They went about their morning as if nothing had happened, because the alternative was to sit with what they had done. And that was a chair neither of them was ready to occupy. Preston found it an hour later, sent to him by a business contact who knew Marcus only as an industry name. Preston read the notification, looked at the name, sat in his car in his driveway for 6 minutes, and then called his father. His father did not answer. He called his mother. She answered and said, "I know." He said, "Mom." She said, "I know." Preston, Natasha, to her credit, took it the most practically. She pulled up every piece of information she could find on Webb Capital Group, compiled it silently, and then placed her phone face down on the kitchen counter and stared at the wall for a moment that lasted by her own later estimation, about as long as a Thanksgiving dinner enjoyed by someone seated in the kitchen. The calls began on Monday afternoon. First, Diane to Claire, warm, effusive, wondering if they might get together for coffee this week. She missed her daughter. It had been too long since they'd had a real conversation. Claire looked at the call log, looked at the date of the business announcement, did arithmetic that took approximately 1 second, and let it go to voicemail. Then Gerald called Marcus directly, which was remarkable in itself, because in 18 months of marriage, Gerald had never called Marcus directly, had barely managed to sustain eye contact for longer than social necessity required. Marcus looked at his phone, set it gently on his desk, and let it ring. Preston texted. His text said, "Saw the news about Webb. Capital. Incredible stuff, man. We should catch up." Marcus read it twice, set his phone down, and returned to the site plan he had been reviewing. It was Claire who decided how this would go, and Marcus who supported her decision completely, because this was her family, and her wound, and her choice to make. She called her mother back on Tuesday evening. She was calm in the way that a river is calm when it is very deep. She said, "I got your message." Diane said she had been thinking about Thanksgiving and hoped that Marcus hadn't been offended by the kitchen arrangement. It had been purely logistical. They adored Marcus. She hoped he knew that. Claire said, "You adore him now." "Diane," said Claire. "That's not." Claire said, "I'd like you and Dad and Preston and Natasha to come to dinner on Saturday at our home. All of you." There was a pause. Diane said that sounded wonderful. Claire said, "Good. 7 o'clock. Then she said goodbye and ended the call with the clean precision of someone closing a file. She and Marcus spent Tuesday and Wednesday evenings preparing dinner together as they always had. This was one of the private rituals of their marriage, cooking together, talking while they moved around the kitchen, a kind of choreography they had developed without discussing it. They made the food they liked. They set the table they owned in the house they had rented, while they evaluated which property to purchase a house that was modest enough to have confirmed every assumption the Hargroves had formed about Marcus, and now, in retrospect, told a different story entirely. Saturday arrived, so did the Hargroves. The shift in their manner was immediate and comprehensive, and a little painful to witness, in the way that watching someone perform a total reversal of themselves without acknowledging the reversal can be painful. Gerald shook Marcus's hand with both hands and held it for a beat too long, looking at him with an expression that was trying to locate, somewhere inside itself, a coherent combination of warmth and apology and self-preservation. Diane embraced Claire with an enthusiasm that had not been present even at their wedding. Preston clapped Marcus on the shoulder and said he had been following Webb Capital for years, which was demonstrably false in a way that was almost too audacious to be offensive, but managed to be both. Natasha smiled with all of her warmth engaged, which was genuine warmth. Marcus acknowledged privately. She was a woman of real feeling when her feelings were properly motivated. They sat in the living room. Marcus poured drinks. The conversation moved carefully, the way conversation moves when everyone in the room is aware of a thing that no one has named yet. Gerald was the one who tried to name it first. He said, "Marcus, we owe you an apology for Thanksgiving." Marcus looked at him and waited. Gerald continued, his voice carrying the specific discomfort of a man who is accustomed to apologies flowing toward him rather than from him. The seating arrangement was. It was poor planning on our part. Diane and I felt badly about it. Diane nodded, her expression earnest and practiced. We should have been more thoughtful. Gerald finished. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. "Gerald," Marcus said, "I'd like to ask you something directly, and I'd like you to answer it directly, because I think we've both earned that much from each other." Gerald nodded, something flickering in his eyes that was not quite apprehension, but was adjacent to it. "If you had read that news article before Thanksgiving, if you had known, before you set the table, who I was and what I owned, would I have been in the kitchen?" The silence was absolute. Diane looked at her hands. Preston examined the middle distance. Natasha took a small sip of her drink. "No," Gerald said. The word was quiet and cost him something real. "That's the problem," Marcus said. "Not the chair. The chair is furniture. The problem is what the chair tells me about how you see other people, what it tells me about the conditions under which I am worth including. Because I was the same person on Thursday that I am right now, sitting here in front of you. My character didn't change. My work ethic didn't change. My love for your daughter didn't change. The only thing that changed is what you know about my bank account. And if that's the variable that determines whether I get a seat at your table, then I need you to understand that we have a much larger problem than seating arrangements." He had not raised his voice. He had not leaned forward. He had delivered it with the same measured, inhabited calm with which he did most things, the calm that his father had modeled and that Marcus had practiced, and that he now carried as naturally as his own posture. Claire was sitting beside him. She did not reach for his hand or insert herself. She let it land. She had her own things to say, and the floor would come to her. "I want to be clear," Marcus continued, "that this conversation is not about the money. The money is not the point, and it never has been. My father built what he built because he believed that genuine work done with integrity compounds over time, and he was right, and I have tried to continue in that spirit. But he also believed, and I believe, that a man who will not look another man in the eye until he knows his net worth is not someone whose opinion of you means very much. I want to matter to this family, not because of web capital, but because I love your daughter, and I intend to spend my life with her, and the people she loves should matter to me, and I should matter to them. That cannot be conditional. That is not how love functions." Preston was looking at the floor. Natasha had set her drink down. Then Claire spoke. She spoke for nearly 5 minutes, and Marcus would not recount every word of it, because those words belonged to her and to her family. But the shape of it was this. She told them about the years of small diminishments, the questions about ceilings, the half-second delayed laughter, the kitchen chair. She told them that she had spent 18 months managing their perception of a man who required no management, who was more than capable of presenting himself, and that the exhaustion of that management had been one of the quiet griefs of her married life so far. She told them that she did not want an apology for Thanksgiving. She wanted a different family. A family that looked at Marcus, at any person, as a full human being before, during, and after knowing anything about their material circumstances. She told them that she would not be asking for this again. When she finished, the room sat with what she had said. Diane's eyes were bright, with tears that were, Marcus believed, genuine. Gerald's jaw worked silently for a moment. Preston was studying the carpet with the intense focus of a man trying to find something to say that will not make everything worse. It was Natasha who spoke next, and this was the moment Marcus had not anticipated. "I'd like to say something," she said quietly. Everyone looked at her. "I grew up with a certain kind of money. The old kind, the kind that has a name attached to it, mostly. Made. And what I can tell you is that there is almost nothing that teaches you worse habits than growing up surrounded by people who sorted other people by what they had. I learned those habits. I brought them here." She looked at Marcus directly, which not everyone had managed to do in the last 20 minutes. "I'm sorry, that's not the kind of person I want to be, and I think tonight is a useful reminder of that." It was perhaps the most honest thing Marcus had heard any of them say. He nodded once and accepted it. Gerald and Diane stayed until almost 11, Preston and Natasha until 10:30. The dinner itself was good, not comfortable, not festive, but real in a way that family dinners rarely manage to be. There were long pauses and careful words and moments where someone started a sentence and then chose a different one. There was an exchange between Preston and Marcus near the end of the evening over coffee. that began with Preston asking about the Hargrove District development plans and moved unexpectedly into something closer to an actual conversation about architecture and urban renewal, and Preston's own frustrated ambition to have done something other than kitchen supplies. Marcus listened. He was good at listening. It was not the beginning of a friendship. It was too early and too fragile to call it anything, but it was the beginning of something. The days that followed settled into a new configuration. It was not a transformation. Real families do not transform overnight, and the Hargroves were not exceptional in that respect. But there were gestures. Gerald called Marcus the following Thursday, not for any particular reason. He said, just checking in, had seen an article about urban development that Marcus might find interesting. The call lasted 11 minutes and was mildly awkward and entirely sincere, which is, in Marcus's experience, the exact texture of a relationship in the early stages of repair. Diane invited Marcus and Claire to dinner in December, and when the table was set, there were exactly the right number of chairs, and each one had a name on it, and Marcus's was at the table. Preston said nothing more about ceilings. Natasha and Claire began texting with a frequency that surprised both of them. The acquisition of the Hargrove District was completed in February. At the signing, Marcus was surrounded by his legal team and Dennis Park and 3 city officials and a dozen people in suits who had spent the last year treating him with a specific type of deference that he had always found uncomfortable. He thought, in the moment the papers were signed, not about the $4 billion or the development plans or the city council's enthusiastic press release, but about his father on a February morning at a gravesite, and about a kitchen counter in the suburbs, and about the particular expression on Claire's face when she had said, "On the drive home that Thanksgiving night. Good." He thought about what it meant that the word good had come so easily to her in that moment. Not triumphant, not vindictive. Just good, with the clean satisfaction of a person who has decided to stop accommodating what does not deserve accommodation. He had fallen in love with her precision. He had not known, until that moment on the highway, the full depth of what that precision could contain. The work of building a marriage and the work of building a city are not as different as people tend to assume. Both require a foundation laid with more care than is visible from the surface. Both require patience with things that take longer than expected and cost more than budgeted and involve more complicated human dynamics than any plan originally accounts for. Both require, at some fundamental level, the belief that what you are building is worth the labor, that the thing at the end will be solid enough to stand in weather that hasn't arrived yet. Marcus believed that. About the city and about his marriage, and tentatively and with appropriate uncertainty, about the family into which he had married. He was not naive about the Hargroves. He did not revise them entirely in the aftermath of that Saturday dinner. He understood that Gerald's new warmth was partly genuine and partly a recalibration driven by information, and he chose, deliberately, to nurture the genuine part and have patience with the rest. He understood that Diane's tears were real, and that they were also accompanied by a new attentiveness to his comfort that told him she was aware, in a way she had not been before, that her previous behavior had cost her something. He accepted these imperfect truths because he was not looking for perfect people. He had never been under the impression that those existed. What he was looking for, and what his father had been looking for, and what Claire had articulated on that Saturday evening in terms that needed no elaboration, was simple: the willingness to see a person fully, without the precondition of net worth or credentials or the right kind of car in the driveway. The willingness to sit across from someone and extend to them the basic grace of assuming that they matter before any evidence has been presented, simply because they are there. This is not a complicated standard. It is the oldest standard. It is the one that gets abandoned first when comfort and status become the primary orientation of a life. And it is the one that returns, if people are fortunate, if someone is willing to hold up the mirror, when the consequences of abandoning it become clear enough to see. Gerald Hargrove kept the article about the Hargrove District acquisition folded in the inside pocket of his winter coat for the better part of 6 months. He could not have told you precisely why he kept it. It was not pride. He was aware that pride was not the appropriate response to his son-in-law's accomplishment, given everything. It was something closer to a reminder. A physical object that represented the gap between what he had seen and what had been true carried on his person so that he could not entirely forget that the gap had existed. On a morning in late April, he took the article out and read it again. Then he folded it very carefully and placed it in the recycling bin. He made himself a coffee. He looked out the window at the morning and thought about a man who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at a kitchen counter without complaint, had driven home that evening with his dignity entirely intact, and had then sat across from a dining room full of people who had failed him and spoken with a clarity and a grace that Gerald was still, privately, measuring himself against. He thought that this was what his wife had missed. In all her calculations about worth and status and the appropriate weight to assign to a consulting architect in a 6-year-old car, she had missed that. The man's worth was visible the whole time. It had been visible in the way he spoke and listened and treated people and carried himself through an afternoon that would have broken the composure of people far less secure in who they were. The money was real, and it was staggering in its scale, and Gerald was honest enough with himself to admit that it had rearranged something fundamental in how he related to his son-in-law. But the worth, the actual human worth, had been there on display from the very beginning, patiently waiting to be seen. Gerald set down his coffee and called Marcus. It was a Tuesday morning. Marcus answered on the second ring. "I was thinking," Gerald said, "about that conversation you and I had in November, the direct one." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for a while." Marcus waited. "I want you to know that I understand what you said. Not just as it applies to you, though it applies to you completely, but as a general principle of how I've operated. I don't say that lightly, and I'm not saying it to earn anything. I'm saying it because it's true." There was silence on the line. Then Marcus said, "Thank you, Gerald," not effusively, not with the warmth of someone who has been waiting to hear it, but with the simple, grounded acceptance of a person who receives a genuine thing and treats it as such. Gerald said, "Right, good." And then, because neither of them were people who wore their emotions on the outside of their sentences, they talked for a few minutes about the Hargrove District project, and Gerald asked one smart question about the retail development footprint that actually surprised Marcus. They agreed to have lunch the following week. Marcus hung up the phone and sat for a moment at his desk. Through the window of his office, an office that was not as grand as people expected when they learned who he was, though it was very good, with a long view of the city that he never got tired of. The April morning was clear and uncomplicated. The sky, the particular shade of blue that belongs to days before the heat arrives and changes everything. He thought about Thanksgiving, about kitchens and dining rooms and the arbitrary architecture of belonging, the invisible floor plans that families draw around people to indicate where they are permitted and where they are not. He thought about how those floor plans get redrawn, not quickly, not completely, but bit by bit. Each small revision, a choice someone makes to see another person differently than they did the day before. He thought it was enough. Not perfect, but enough to build from. He picked up his pencil. He still worked in pencil. Always. It was one of the habits his father had given him, and returned to the plans spread across his desk. There was a lot of city left to build. Here is what this story asks each of us to consider. The way we measure people, the quick, unconscious calculus we run on strangers and acquaintances, and even people we are supposed to love, what is it actually based on? What are we actually seeing when we look at someone and decide, in the space of a moment, how much of our attention they deserve? Because Marcus Webb sat in that kitchen, and the only thing that changed between that moment And the moment the Hargroves read his name in a newspaper was their knowledge, not his character, not his capacity to contribute to their family, not the quality of his love for their daughter, only their knowledge. And that knowledge changed everything, which means the way they treated him before was never really about him at all. What would you have done in that kitchen? And what would you have done sitting at Gerald's kitchen table on a Monday morning, reading that article and feeling the weight of what that chair in the kitchen now meant? We would genuinely love to know your thoughts. Leave them in the comments below. And if this story moved you, or made you think, or reminded you of something you've witnessed or experienced yourself, please give it a like. It means more than you know for stories like this one to find the audience they're meant for. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we have more stories coming that we think you'll want to be here for. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, wherever in the world you are. Take care of yourselves and look at the people around you. Really, look at them. You might be surprised by what you've been missing.